because I've got a fancy mic in front of me, that's why. Good. All right. So we can get started. Excellent.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. So the title of the first presentation, which is quite exciting, of this conference, or at least the online day, is Skills and Employability. And we're talking about doctoral education here right now, and in the context of global transformation of doctoral education. I'm really excited to announce that I developed this presentation with my colleague Sonia Cardoso, who is also on the call here from Portugal. Recently this year, I was on sabbatical in Europe and spent some time in Portugal at the beautiful University of Aveiro, and met Sonia and some of her colleagues. And the ideas that we're presenting here really arose through those conversations that we had there and the exchange of ideas, data, insights that we had. So what we're presenting here is really a preliminary analysis of what we found and basically the intersection of all our research questions and our research work. So and for me, there's a bit of a call to action at the end, and I'm really curious to hear your experiences in comparative studies and where you think the potential of comparative studies such as this one is. So we'll talk about that at the end. But for now, before we proceed, as is custom in Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I work and study. In Sydney, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we sit whenever we do a presentation on campus or online. And so I want to pay my respects to those who have cared on and continue to care for country here in Australia. Thank you. Now, the structure of this talk, I will definitely not go over time. I like short presentations and leaving lots of time for questions and answers. I hope you appreciate that, so we can have a good conversation. Bit of an introduction, bit of context, the research context. I'll talk a little bit about the methodology, which is quite various for us, and we'll focus on the findings and then leave some time for questions and answers. A little bit about me, just so it makes sense where this research is situated and how I approach this. So my work experience is really it started in teaching at the university in terms of language teaching, international studies teaching. I have experience in learning design, academic development, research project management, all the things that probably all of us have done at some point. But more recently, I have been based at the business school at the University of Sydney, and I'm a senior lecturer there. I teach on leadership, I supervise PhD students, and I continue my research in higher education and doctoral education. More recently, I've published in the area of academic career progression, PhD skills, and I still focus on skill development and graduate attributes. My beautiful campus, I love showing off some of our buildings. This is the building where I am situated. It's quite Instagrammable. People love coming and visiting. All right, let's get to the study. So I really see the background or the context of our research in 3 dimensions. So the first one here is what Sonia and her colleagues really coined as the deep transformation in doctoral education. And there are 2 factors that really stand out. And I should say at this stage, Sonia, feel free to come in and add any comments or additions. So the massification is something we all very aware of course. This means increased enrollments. We have more and more PhD students enrolling in our programs, and that's pretty much a global trend. There are, of course, countries where that's different, but overall, we're seeing increased enrollments, greater number of doctorates being awarded, but very importantly, doctoral candidates becoming more diverse. And so the skill sets, their backgrounds, their professional ambitions, personal expectations are quite diverse. And then there's the professionalization factor. We see more and more PhD students actually turning towards non-academic employment, be it either a motivation to do a PhD, such is the case in Germany, and I'll talk a little bit about later, or they change that during their candidature, understanding that or realizing that actually there's not enough stable employment options here for me, or their attitude or their opinions about research work have changed, and so they turn to non-academic employment options. And so employability is more or less becoming a quality indicator of PhD programs. The second dimension is the academic socialization. We know that there's lots of talk about the precarity in the academic profession, deterioration of working conditions. It's hard to be an academic. It's hard to maintain stable academic position, and that being the context into which our doctoral students are being socialized into doesn't become a fertile ground for students to really pursue academic careers, and so that again also turns them away from academia towards non-academic positions. The third dimension is that national, regional, and local influence that, of course, plays a role in how doctoral programs are shaped. So higher education contexts do vary by country in terms of structure, governance, funding, perhaps the size and shape of the programs. These influences, of course, take place in the institution, at the institutional level as well, and the doctoral program level, respectively. So, and all that shapes and forms the candidate. So there's an intricate relationship between what's happening at the institutional level, national level, and the program design level. And all of these three factors kind of form the research context in which we really engage with our participants. And so the way I view this is like this funnel here, where the massification, professionalization, the academic socialization, and the national institutional influences really lead lead to this transformation of doctoral education that Sonia and colleagues have talked about. They have conducted a systematic literature review where they looked at the different structuring dimensions of a doctoral program, things like foundations, objectives of the programs, the technique, the process, things like milestones and the different phases and stages of a doctoral program, expertise, organization of doctoral programs. And what stood out for them is that they actually saw the major changes occur in the competencies and employability. In those two dimensions is where we see most transformations, most change and disruption happening in the last couple of decades. So, and that's really the context. That was really the, And that was really the context in which we met and started talking. And what happened is during the sabbatical is when we started talking and exchanging ideas of what did I do and what did you find out and how did you feel about this and how did you interpret this? We actually realized there was so much convergence, and we really thought this is an interesting idea to explore. We wanted to put this out to the community, such as yourselves, to see whether that resonates with you and whether there is more work to be done or whether we can gain some really interesting insights from drawing on country comparisons. So what we ended up doing is we looked at 3 sets of interview data, essentially: Portugal, Germany, and Australia. Sonia was responsible for the study conducted in Portugal, and I and my colleague in Germany were responsible for conducting interviews in Germany and Australia. The data set essentially are interviews and focus groups with doctoral candidates, different stages of their degree. We have a fairly equal split between males and females. In Portugal, Sonia talked to candidates from different disciplines, whereas in Germany and Australia, we focused on business students. So the studies were quite varied, but what was interesting is that there was a lot of similarity, and that's what we're trying to bring out here. What's important, of course, the overlapping factor, of course, that our research foci, while they varied in some parts, there was one core idea which was around skill development and employability, and all two studies asked students around these areas, asked questions around these areas. So what we found were essentially 5 themes. So the way we structured the findings were 5 themes that came up for us as converging ideas across the 3 national contexts. The first was agency. So doctoral candidates demonstrate immense proactiveness in the way they seek skill development opportunities, and being very mindful of needing to develop their research capacity, but also transferable skills, or Sonia refers to them as transversal skills, because of the need to possibly work outside academia. So students are very well aware that they kind of need to position themselves for diverse career options. So lots of students talk about we need to look beyond research skill development. This is not going to be enough. What if I don't get a job in academia? A great focus on soft skill development. Students are very aware that this is where they need to place their focus on. Communication skills came up quite a lot for this particular candidate in Germany. This was an absolute focus for him, because he was working with industries outside academia, and he was really keen to develop his communication skills for various audiences, in various modes, so he could bring us research essentially to a broader audience and make it accessible to a non-expert audience. And this particular one I found quite interesting, because that spoke, and there were a couple of other comments along this line, and this was really speaking to this idea of, if I'm researching this particular niche area, I will not be employable, and I need to really widen my horizon and look beyond my PhD. The second theme was that awareness of precarity. Again, knowing very well, understanding that they might need to navigate different careers, and might need to change course, and so preparing themselves for non-academic work experience, or taking up non-academic work experiences, gravitating towards applied research, doing lots of networking, attending career events, career expos, and things like that, to make use of the time during the PhD, but actually setting themselves up for perhaps a non-academic position. And this was another, the theme of hope was something that I reported in my earlier research as well, when we talked to early career researchers and about why they're doing certain things and how they perceive the factor of time. And there was this really dominant sentiment that they were waiting for something better to happen, and they were taking up casual academic positions or short-term positions, contracts, hoping and waiting for that tenure job or that ideal academic job that they always wanted. And we find this in these conversations as well. So again, doctoral candidates engage in considerable additional activities outside their PhDs to set themselves up for diverse careers. And as they call, actually I should have put that in quotation because that's actually what the students were referring to. I need to build career capital for a non-academic position. The fourth theme was putting demands on the university to provide them with the support. So this was, particularly for me, this was quite a new theme. This is something that I only recently started picking up in my research, in my conversations with the students, whereas about 2 or 3 years ago, when I ran similar studies, the students were quite firm on thinking that it was up to them to make themselves employable beyond research, beyond academia. Whereas in this recent study, there is a perceived demand that actually it should be the university's job to prepare me for not just academic jobs, but for non-academic jobs as well. So that responsibility is somewhat shifting. And I remember one student saying, well, if the university can guarantee me an academic job or doesn't even provide good...
2 minutes.
They have to, thank you. They have to set me up for other jobs as well. And the fifth theme is, the value of the PhD. Saying that not all industries and not all other sectors actually appreciate the PhD the way they would. And in Portugal, I think that was quite a pronounced problem, actually, Sonia. I remember discussing that. Portugal being more of a small company, small organization economy, they don't value the PhD the same way German employers, non-academic employers value, for example. And that is probably the case for Australia as well. Now, just to wrap it up, in conclusion, what we find is that there are these converging experiences, which was really interesting to us, looking at different countries, different cultural contexts, but there are these similar experiences in perspectives and behaviors in relation to skill development and employability. So what we're seeing overall, that there is the purpose of PhD is shifting, but interestingly for us, it's actually shifted by the candidate themselves. And so for us, there's an emerging provocation that comes up, whether the traditional doctorate actually still meets the demands of the knowledge society economy. And that's something we're happy to discuss. And to finish off, basically our findings add support that it should be commonplace for transferable skills to be developed during the PhD, to increase their employability from diverse non-academic contexts. We also found that students perceive that transferable skill development is not well integrated in the doctoral curriculum. That's across the institutions and across the countries. While we acknowledge that the challenge for universities, of course, is to balance, the demand of academic excellence and achieving social relevance, it's really hard to balance. We understand that it's really hard to balance that with preparing doctoral graduates for diverse career path, which is not really the traditional purpose of the PhD. So what we really invite you to think about here with us and to share your perspectives or maybe experiences is on what can we learn from multinational comparisons like this? And is this a good way to approach this? And have you done anything similar like this? We'd love to hear from you. And I'll stop here and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. We now have 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to ask anything, feel free to raise your hand or put the questions in the chat, and I can read them out. Oh, we already have one. So could the person who raised their hand unmute and ask their question?
Right.
Hello, everyone. I'm Arokya. I don't know if I'm audible.
Yep. Yes, you are. We can hear you. Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. And it feels really encouraging to find colleagues at the other part of the globe working on doctoral education. I'm also a scholar working on doctoral education, so I'm quite excited and quite chimed up with the presentation. So I had one clarification question regarding the 42 participants who participated in the interviews. So like, why such a like defamiliarized approach regarding their identity, regarding are they international students? Are they people who are coming back from work, or like their experience and just sticking to their identity of just being a doctoral scholar? One, and could you talk me more through the 42 participants? One aspect. And the second is like much more of a comment rather than a question. Maybe the expectation is also grounded, institutional expectation is also grounded in the fact that more institutionalization mechanisms have taken place in the doctoral program itself, like incorporation of milestones, what you should do by this year, second year, third year, expectations of structure emerging rather than what it was like before 2001. So yeah, so thus the expectations that the institution is interacting and the traditional mode of PhD has changed. So that was one comment to think about. But I would like to hear more about the participants. Who are the people who you have captured in the 3 country contexts? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name at the beginning and it broke off.
Aroke, you can call me Aroke.
I'm okay. Okay. Aroke, I caught the last bit. I didn't catch the middle and the middle bit. Sorry, you kept breaking off. But the last bit, who are the participants in the study? So as I said, we in Germany and Australia, we focus on business PhD students, and there were students in first, second, and third year. My participants were all full-time students and equally females and males. And in the Portugal context, we again had a very diverse student cohort from memory, right, Sonia? If you'd like to say to that, Sonia?
I can describe our participants. They were from 3 national public universities. This was they came from a sample of students that we tried to be as representative as possible from the programs that we were analyzing. This was a study that we conducted with all the Portuguese doctoral programs. We selected for analysis 118 of these programs, and from those programs, the programs of 3 public universities, and we ended up selecting focus groups. We intended to make 15 focus groups, but students were not so easy to contact and to recruit to interview. So we ended up by interviewing 31 students from their first year. And the first year was chosen because it was easier to reach these students because they were at the curricular year, so they were for sure more involved in the program with the university, and we conducted 27 focus groups and 4 individual interviews, and these were doctoral students from several research or scientific fields, from several engineering, social sciences, humanities, etc. And they were in the first year, and they were equally distributed by gender.
Thank you, Sonia.
I think
Great to have you
I have
here.
answered.
I think there was another hand up there for a bit. Joanna, was that you?
It was me, if we still have time, but I'll be brief.
Yes, we have about 4 minutes,
Okay.
so yes.
I'll be brief so that other colleagues can speak. So first of all, thanks for the interesting presentation. So this is more a comment. So I think there's a lot of potential in the comparative analysis, and I was wondering whether you are aiming to frame this as a multiple case study approach and whether you'll be considering Portugal as a case study of contrast. The reason why I'm saying this is that we have Germany and Australia, two major players in terms of research, and the scenario in Portugal is particularly different. Even though there has been a lot of progress in Portugal in terms of research development, we are still low comparing to the European average, and there's a lot of precarity. So it doesn't surprise me that the demand for university support emerged as a new theme. It makes sense for me. So I was wondering whether explaining the context and framing Portugal as a case study of contrast would work. Thank you.
Yeah. Sonia, would you like to comment on that?
I think it is a very good idea when maybe me and Lilia will work further on the paper, maybe for publication, and we for sure will have that in mind. So thank you, Joanna, for sharing that perspective with us. Indeed, the Portuguese case is quite different from Germany and Australia, and in some of these dimensions that Lilia presented, our students revealed some nuances, different perspectives regarding the other doctoral candidates or students. So we have to explore that and frame that better in the paper, calling the attention for the specificities of the Portuguese case. Thank you.
Okay, I think we don't have time for another question. So Martin, feel free to put your question in the chat, and Sonia and Lilia can maybe write an answer there. But we are now moving on to Georgiana.
Thank you so much, everyone. I actually, unfortunately, have to leave because I've got a very important event to attend to. But
I will suggest one thing, if it is possible, if I can leave our emails on the chat. Lilia, can you leave your email, and I will do the same, and we'll try to answer the questions, not now maybe, but together after. Okay.
Excellent idea.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
See you later.
All right. Thank you. And yes, we are moving on to Georgiana.
Oh, thank you, everyone. I guess we're going second then. I'm going to share my screen here.
Was that not the order?
I think the order was different.
Yeah, I thought I was next.
Yes.
Oh, apologies.
Richard, do you want to go now?
I think I have the wrong order in front of me. I'm so sorry. Richard, you are up next. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I thought maybe I was looking at an old version of the program or something. I'd been
no, you're completely right.
No,
I was looking at the wrong version. Feel free to go.
Okay, right. So I'll just screen share. Now, can I check? Can people see that? Yeah, grand. Okay.
Insight.
Right. Let's. Oh, I can't get the. I can't. I can't get it to the regular view, unfortunately. I can't reach the controls on the top. Hang on. Let's see if I can. Oh yeah, here we go. Sorry. I ought to know how to do this by now, shouldn't I? Right. Here we go. Okay. So yeah, I'll begin now. Thank you. So my presentation is also about professional development, but it's more people who are doctoral graduates and moving into the early career researcher space. It's talking about a collected book that myself and a few colleagues have co-edited, which is the manuscript's literally just been submitted a couple of weeks ago. And it's trying to help people who have recently graduated in their doctorate move into publication in a supported manner. So I'm going to be talking about that. Now, if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, there's 4 names there. So Richard Waller, that's me. Then there's Jane Andrews and Tim Clark, who are 2 colleagues from the University of the West of England in Bristol, where I am. The logo's at the bottom. And then there's another name in red, my colleague Laura Manison, who's another colleague from UWE, and she's also one of the contributors to the book. So all will be revealed in a moment. Right. Oh, now it's not letting me move this on. This is annoying. Oh, there we go. Right, I won't read this out, but this is the abstract. It's talking about the value of insider research, professional research. Most of the people are from our professional doctorate in education, the EdD program, rather than a PhD route, although there is one PhD student within the collection. So this is about career progression and also about giving people a wider platform for the research they've undertaken. So we've pulled together a book, and I'm going to talk about the process, because for us the process is at least as important as the actual outcomes, as a potential model for other colleagues on such programs to consider adopting. So we had 14 books, which were 14 chapters, sorry, which were all co-authored by the doctoral student as the lead author, and in most cases, not quite every case, because we gave that person a choice, a second, more experienced academic, usually one of the supervisory team, acts as a second author, or in one case, a third author as well. And so I'm going to talk about the process, and then hand over to Laura, who's going to talk about her own experience of being part of this process. So, brief overview of the session. So I'm going to introduce the book, talk a little bit about the background context. Now, forgive me, some of you will know this, in which case you may think, well, can we skip this bit? Some of you may not know anything about this or have zero interest in it, in which case you may think you either want to know more or you've already heard more enough. And then we're going to reflect on the process as well once we've heard from Laura about her own experiences of this as well. And then we end up with in case questions aren't forthcoming otherwise, we end up with a number of prompts for possible discussion to get people to reflect on what they think the value of what we've done is. So in terms of the history of this idea, it goes way back. I've been around a long time, and this goes back to a 2010 collection, edited then by 2 of my then colleagues, both of whom have retired since, Anne-Marie Bathmaker and Penelope Harnett. And they pulled together a collection with Routledge called Exploring Learner, Identity and Power Through Life History and Narrative Research. And that was primarily using research that had been undertaken within our then Faculty of Education. And we had a few other people, external contributors as well. And it was a way of trying to help build the research community, which is something we've revisited in this program itself. Now, I took over with my colleague Jane Andrews, who's one of the non-present presenters, if you like. We became joint leaders of our professional doctorate in education, or EdD program, in 2014, so nearly 10 years ago. And we discussed trying to get some kind of book, but it's taken a while to happen for various reasons. Jane and I were both included in the 2010 collection as ourselves then relatively early career researchers. So what we're seeking to do is get an opportunity for postgraduate degree successful postgraduates to support the transition into early career researcher status, because we often find that people get their EdD and then that's it. They lose a sense of momentum, they perhaps lose the impetus and the initiative, and perhaps don't necessarily have the knowledge to then move into publication and then give their research a wider airing that it would deserve. So we sought to pull together a collection of academic outputs that would showcase critical research into professional practice. We discussed this. I discussed this with commissioning editors at a couple of conferences, including SRHE, over the years. We got a provisional agreement from Emerald Press, who we're publishing with. We then had to submit a formal proposal for the book, and which got reviewed and everything, and was accepted. We received some internal workload support from our department, which was useful, as well, because this was quite a time-consuming process, far more so than just writing a book ourselves would be, probably. We asked for expressions of interest, EOIs, from recent, I'll put in quote marks there, PGR graduates, postgrad research graduates, particularly from the EdD. To our surprise, we were initially anticipating 8 to 10 chapters, and we got over 20 expressions of interest, which then left us with a bit of a dilemma in terms of, could we include them all? We spoke with the publishers that in terms of the original word limit we were given for the book, it wasn't going to be feasible to include everyone because the chapters would be too short. There'd be something like 4,000 or 5,000 words, and we felt that wasn't really sufficient space, so we had to go through a selection process, and we've ended up with 14 chapters, which meant obviously there was a number of disappointed colleagues, which was quite a difficult aspect to kind of manage. We recruited a third editor. We decided to bring in one of our own relatively early career researchers who's maybe just past the stage of seeking their first publication, someone who's had a couple of publications but hadn't had experience of editing or writing books, which both myself and Jane have. I've got quite a bit of experience in terms of edited collections across a range of areas. And then we decided to develop a kind of scaffolded approach to supporting the writing. And that included working in collaboration with a co-author. Now, the manuscript was just submitted 5 weeks ago, I think, and we've just finished last week. We just finished with the last of the queries from the manuscripts. So it's now with the copy editors and everything. We hope to see the copy sometime soon after Christmas, with a view to seeing the publication itself in the kind of late spring time. So in terms of setting the scene, the background policy, so we've pulled up on a couple of things. There's the researcher concordat, and the reference is in the HTML link down the bottom, and it's talking about the need to create a healthy and supportive culture needed to ensure our researchers are given every opportunity to thrive and realize their potential. And it's about trying to provide researchers with opportunities and times to develop their research identity and broad leadership skills. Now, some of the people who are graduates on our EdD program are in fact academic colleagues at our university, and indeed a few other universities whose staff come onto the course. But the majority are actually people working in practice, working as perhaps middle or senior leaders in schools or further education colleges or early year settings, right across a whole range of areas, including things like health education and so on as well. And those people probably have less opportunity in terms of developing an academic publications career compared to academic colleagues, albeit I realize that itself is by no means easy. So one of the other policies we draw on is what's called the Hanover Recommendations for Doctoral Education, back from 2019, and it was talking about the need to develop researchers of the future. And then I've just included for context a few sort of headline figures from the education ref unit, so unit 23, under the Research Excellence Framework. And there was a fall in the number of ECRs, early career researchers, submitted to main panel C, which is what education falls under. So it's dropped from 19% in Ref 2014 down to 16% in Ref 2021. And then there's also a comment about how postgrad research students and early career researchers as well, in fact, for that matter, are increasingly recognized as a crucial part of the vitality and intellectual life of research units. And those of you familiar with the REF, and I'm a REF unit lead, so I probably know it pretty well, but I realize not all of you will. But there's also now a shift in terms of the increasing importance of what used to be called the environment to incorporate things like development opportunities for junior research colleagues and the like. So in terms of what we're doing, and this is in the, we submitted this to the Postgraduate Scholarship and Practice Network, and it's about trying to develop these practitioner researcher identities. I draw also upon BERA, which is the British Education Research Association, our kind of wider learned society, whereas obviously SRHE is a bit more specialized in that regard. It talks about close to practice research that focuses on improving educational practices, which is what one of the things an EdD or any other professional doctorate needs to do. As well as meeting all the markers of a PhD, it also needs to have recommendations for practice, which is one of the things that differentiates them. And what we've tried to develop is a model that aligns to this kind of close to practice research and the benefits, the associated benefits for the practitioner researcher identities. So in terms of the development, a little bit more detail, we tried to use a project that would build a community practitioner research community, and support the progression of the doctoral graduates to early career researcher status. So every author was given the opportunity, wasn't a requirement, but an opportunity which most of them took up to co-write with their doctoral supervisor or indeed with another experienced academic, which one or two of them took up rather than their supervisor for various reasons, including retirement as supervisors and so on. And we also paired them up across the piece, so they had a nominated writing buddy who could act as a critical friend. We held periodic writing retreats, and we had various guidance sessions as well, workshops, how to write an abstract, you know, how to present your work, how to help cut down your work from a thesis which was either 80,000 or 60,000 words, depending whether it's PhD or EdD, how to try and cut it down to the length of the chapter, which people were permitted just over 7,000 words in terms of an upper word limit. We then offered guidance videos as well. We recorded a few things for people to look at, and then we had regular kind of meetings. We gave opportunities for people to present at various events. We took a symposium to the BERA conference, for instance. We've had a few events locally at our university. There's also this event at SRHE today as well. And then finally, one of the other benefits, as well as increasing things that may be considered for the Research Excellence Framework, the REF 2028 outputs, we also was seeking to develop not just the authors, the lead authors of the chapters, but indeed our co-editor, who's now had the experience of working on and submitting a manuscript for publication. And he's in fact, excuse me, it's Tim Clark, and he's in fact working with another colleague and just submitting an edited book proposal with another one of our colleagues, partly having gone through the process with myself and Jane Andrews. So we divided the 14 chapters we had to maintain some kind of coherence and relevance, rather than divide them in terms of settings, maybe early years and primary and then secondary and whatever education. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to try and look at more of a thematic process of dividing them up. So we ended up with 3 different thematic areas, and this largely, most of the research arises from one of the modules on our EdD, which is called Researching Education Policy and Professional Identities. And it's about how the interplay of education policy can either enable or restrict professional autonomy and other senses around and other things that input into professional identity in a range of settings. So we had the areas there: the constructions of the professional and society, interrogating approaches to being, becoming, and developing as educational professionals and challenging education policy and practice. So in terms of the value, we've received a lot of support from people who we've spoken to about this project, including the reviewers. They talk about things like a potential huge contribution to the impact of policy, and its varied contexts, and so on and so forth. I'm aware time's running out, so I'm going to hasten it slightly. We've encouraged a sort of friend of mine, a colleague, Professor Meg Maguire from KCL in London, to write a final chapter drawing together some of the thoughts. And she talks about how the chapters help interpret, enact, and sometimes disrupt policy. And it shows how colleagues in a range of settings can undertake that. And looks at discourses of power and instrumentalism and the like. So she's talking about the content of the book. And again, forgive me, I'm not going to have time to go through both of those quotes. One more thing from me, and then I'll hand over to Laura. Now, Meg's also written about the process as well, giving us feedback on what she thought the process we undertook. And she talked about it here as being an excellent model that others could employ to develop the academic writing of early career researchers, aiding them to make early steps into publication or publishing following postgraduate research, which is really useful. And then she also said a concern that many of us share is that frequently after the completion of doctoral studies and so on, often the research isn't revisited. So this is something we wanted to try and avoid. So I'll shut up now and pass you over to Laura. So Laura,
2 minutes.
Oh, apologies.
We can maybe extend the presentation and have a slightly shorter Q&A.
That's good with me, if that's okay with Laura. So Laura, do you want to screen share, or do you just want to talk to these slides and I can control these?
If you control them, that's great.
Yeah,
that will
speed
save
things
time.
up. Yeah, go on.
I'll tell you a next slide, please, when I'm ready.
Chris Whitty type. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Richard. Yes, so just picking up from what Meg said about the book, the idea, this collection just feels it really resonates what her words do. It feels very dynamic. And through being published in the book, we as a group of ECRs are being facilitated, empowered to build on our thesis and publish more. And brief plug for me here is I'm presenting the meat really of my chapter face-to-face at the conference on Wednesday in Birmingham. So right from the get-go, there's lots of initial discussion and guidelines given by the editors. And we were supported by Richard, Jane and Tim, and each of us was given our person who was in charge of the section. So Richard talked about the 3 sections. So my contribution is in the first section, and Jane was my go-to person at that point. We had lots of support and given those overarching guidelines, but I think crucially, they stepped back and we had a lot of autonomy. And I think Richard will agree with me here that all the chapters, while we've got their overarching theme running through, they're all very, very different, and our contributions are very different ones. I'd say that we were scaffolded to achieve here. And something that really worked well for me and the little group of people who I was working with for the first section was the Twilight Writing Retreats, where we met online several times, about 6 o'clock, about 6 of us with Jane Andrews, our section editor. And it built a smaller community of practice from the bigger group, and it was really beneficial being able to bounce those ideas off our colleagues, our peers, but also Jane there as our expert, I guess. So that was really, really useful. Next slide, please. And talking about my co-author, so my co-author was Catherine, who was one of my supervisors for the doctorate, and so it's quite an organic process, and she supported the methodological aspect of my thesis. So we're suddenly in a situation where I became the lead author and our positionality changed, which was a really interesting process for me to reflect on. And during the EdD, Catherine had roused my interest in narrative. But then as my research and my own interest increased, I specifically embraced poetic representation to discuss my data. And so again, our role shifted and I became the expert. And by her own admission, Catherine learned from me, which was, I think it was really, really powerful. And final slide, please, Richard. And I also engaged with autoethnography in my thesis, and Catherine joined me in this and took a massive step out of her comfort zone. And for the book chapter, represented some of her own work as autoethnographic poetry. And that has since inspired her to the point that we're now we've developed a new working relationship, which is very much based on a new trust and respect. We're working on a couple of publications at the moment, using the approaches that we developed specifically for this book chapter. And I'm really interested in this positionality and our working relationship, because I think it's worth noting here that Catherine is actually my line manager as well. So we have all these different dynamics going on, that this would not have happened had it not been for this book chapter. So it's benefited me as an ECR, but also inspired Catherine, who hadn't really written in this way before. And hopefully on the back of this, we will be producing several new papers together shortly. Thank you. I did that as succinctly as possible.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Laura. So, oops, I'm just trying to. Yeah, there we go. So there's some references, including references to the book itself, and also to Laura and Catherine's chapter in the middle of the 5 there. And then finally, I'll just bring up the slide with our ideas for questions, and I'm happy to take any other questions, but just in case other people are thinking of things to say. I think by my reckoning, we've got about 7 minutes, Jan. Is that about right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay,
yes.
Grant. So I've just said there, what are your observations of the process? What are your current approaches if you're in the academic space? What are your current approaches to supporting doctoral graduates and their next steps into career development or publication? Or alternatively, if you are yourself an ECR, or for that matter, a PGR student even, how would you like to be supported? And then just thinking about barriers and challenges. Okay, I'll be quiet.
If anyone wants to engage with any of these talking points or just wants to raise their hand, please feel free, or the chat as well. Feel free to use that as your medium if you want. There we go. Eta.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I think it's a fantastic idea to engage with recent graduates and help them develop their writing publications. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on the sustainability of this project? And, are you planning to continue with this and create maybe a series of, book on, doctoral research projects like this? That's number one. Number two is, do you think that this type of project or research development project is applicable in other disciplines outside of educational research? Thank you.
Okay, right. Well, I'll have a go first and then hand over to Laura if she wants to add anything else. Yeah, so we are hoping to sustain this. We've obviously, with the publication hopefully coming out in April or May, we plan to have a big book launch, and we're going to have various presentations there, and we hope to take some of these to other conferences. And yes, we have actually, Itam, that's a good question. Yes, we have agreed in principle a second volume on a slightly different focus. As I said, this largely came from, although there's one PhD doctoral graduate in the 14, the other 13 have all come through the professional doctorate. And much of the work is focused on things they did in one of the taught modules before the research phase of the EdD. We've now agreed in principle with the publisher to produce a second volume based on one of the other modules, which is more around the kind of theory of learning and teaching. And so we're going to, Jane Andrews and I are going to be launching that with an expressions of interest to colleagues in the new year after Christmas. Some people know about that, some people don't. So this is not quite a scoop, but not all of our colleagues know that we're going to be doing this. In terms of the, and it would be nice to see it going on. And I think in terms of also the longer term, building the idea of us building a stronger community of practice with early career researchers and so on is something that will hopefully be self-generating. And obviously there's our EdD programs quite large. We've had an intake of 25 for this year. Obviously, you know, we can't fit all 25 into one book, even if all of those were going to write for publication. And we've got a lot of people who've been through it recently, but the opportunity is there certainly. And I think once people get a taste for this and realize that it's not, you know, there's no magic solution to this, then hopefully they'll be able to see that this can be continued. And that's the sort of thing I think Laura was talking about, and she can maybe say a wee bit more about that. In terms of the applicability, yeah, I think this could easily be, I'm a sociologist in terms of my home discipline, if you like, sociologist of education, and I could easily see as long as there's sufficient ECRs, you know, or doctoral graduates, that this could be done with the support of publishers. And as I say, Emerald's, I've worked with quite a few publishers over the years, and I think Emerald has been really good on this without plugging them necessarily. I don't know if they're a sponsor of the conference, so maybe other publishers are available, of course. Okay, right, Laura, over to you.
Okay, just briefly, obviously this whole process has happened for us at the end of our doctorate, and you know, while we were still working on it, it wasn't a thing. But I think this is a great incentive for new recruits to the programme. You know, it's tough doing an EdD because most of us are doing it alongside working full-time. I was working full-time and I was leading a programme, a teacher education programme at the time. And you know, sometimes things like, oh, well, I may be part of a published collection at the end of it is an incentive to keep going, really. So yeah, and I think it is sustainable for even just for that reason.
Right. I think we sadly do not have a time for another question, but then if anyone has any other questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the chat. Or if Laura and Richard, if you want to follow what previous speakers did and leave your emails for people to send questions, feel free. Don't feel like you have to either. And we now move on to Georgiana.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. I see, sorry, Karen Jones has emailed me. Sorry, put something in chat. I'll ask her to email me.
Richard,
right?
if you could just stop sharing your screen.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, that as well.
Has that worked?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. All right.
Good afternoon. Actually, it's still morning in the UK. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see the slides?
We can see the slides and we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm going to kick it off for the last presentation in this panel. Thank you for all the people who spoke before us. This presentation will focus on two steps we did in the project, where we're trying to understand how higher education institutions in the UK and Australia are engaging with this idea of being highly dependent on fees from international students. And this project is conducted together with my name is Georgiana Mihut, and the project is conducted together with Joanna Almeida, Chen, Philip Chan, and Hong Jie Chan from the University of Monash. And Joanna and I are based at the University of Warwick, and this project was funded through the Monash Warwick Alliance Activation Fund by the University of Warwick. So we have four broad sections to our presentation today. I will talk a bit about the context in which we situate this work, and then my colleagues will proceed to talk about a literature review we've conducted on how institutions and systems respond to funding loss, and also what we know about current policies for international student recruitment in the UK, as well as the next steps for the project. So what is the context in which we are situating this work? It's in the UK context is a rather financial picture that we want to engage with and respond to and better understand. So the higher education system in the UK makes a lot of money. In 2021, 2022, the system accrued over £48 billion across different sources of revenues that the institutions have. But this is only half of the picture. The system is also very expensive to run. So you see that in many of the years here, actually the cost of the system exceeded the income. So the expenditure was higher than the amount of money coming in, including in the latest number available from HISA, which is for 2021, 2022 here. So although it's making a lot of money, it also costs a lot of money to run. The other thing to understand is what are the sources of income for the system? What keeps the system going here? And one of the aspects you see on the slide is the change in funding streams throughout years for higher education institutions in the UK. So you saw that essentially throughout most of its history, the system has been mostly funded through fees, but the degree to which it is funded by fees altogether, this includes fees from all students and from all educational contracts, that fraction has increased over time. So the system as a whole is highly reliant on fees. Among sources of fees, one of the usual classifications is by source type compared to the source of the students. So you see here that we have fees from UK-based students, EU-based students, and non-EU-based international students. And you see that across these three sources of tuition fees, there has been an increase in fees from all of these categories of beneficiaries, including for domestic students and from non-EU overseas students. But actually, the fraction of tuition fee revenue coming from non-EU overseas students has also increased in this period of time. So we went from this is the latest number available in the comparative data set from HISA, from 28% just in 2016-17. This is not a long time ago. This is a very few number of years ago, to 38% in 2021-2022. So fraction of income coming from tuitions from non-EU international students has increased in the system. Now, this in itself can be something that the system can be careful about and worried about, but there's another element to this picture, and that is the fact that there isn't really an even distribution of students from across the globe coming to the UK. We see a dependency on students from China and India as leading countries of origin for the international students here. I think over 25% of all international students come from these source countries, and this varies a lot by program institution. So we have a system that's highly dependent on fees, with an increasing fraction of fees coming from international students, and then among that, chiefly the sources come from students in two countries. So that's what I wanted to point out about the context in which this work is situated. And the conclusion in this context is that the UK as a system is highly reliant on fees from international students. Within this project in which we're trying to understand institutional preparation for funding loss and responses to funding loss from international students, we have been able to make progress on two of our steps, and my colleagues will talk about them. The first one will be a discussion on what we know about how institutions and systems respond when there is funding loss. Funding loss is a feature of higher education systems and higher education institutions, and we know quite a bit about this, but the literature you're going to hear about from my colleague Jill is not focused specifically on funding loss from international students, but reactions to funding loss in general. Now you'll hear from Joanna talk about UK-based international policies in this space. And I'll pass on to Jill.
Thank you, Georgiana. Hello everyone, I'm Jewel. Next, I'll continue with the literature review part, focusing on how higher education institutions and systems respond to funding loss. Now let's start by summarizing the focus of the literature on funding loss. Firstly, regarding the countries of the focus, we have found that most studies focus on two countries, Australia and the US, but research has also been done on other countries. The UK is included here. Secondly, when we look at sources of funding loss, here is an important finding from the literature, which is, other than revenue from international students, most articles discuss other sources, including tuition fees from home students, government funding, funding reforms, state budget and state appropriations, taxpayer, donors, and licensing fees. Even though in general, there would be various factors attributing to higher education funding loss. Loss of public funding is often linked to macroeconomic events, for example, financial crisis and COVID-19. Then let's move on to the main part of literature review, which is about institutional and system level responses to funding loss. Let's talk about institutional responses first. Based on the literature we have reviewed, this part has been well documented. To sum up, there are two main categories of responses from higher education institutions. One is about cost cutting and cost saving. The other one is about generating additional revenue. Now I'll elaborate each aspect in detail. The measures and strategies used by universities to cut and save costs are listed below. Number one, controlling library budget. For example, the study of college and university libraries in Indiana shows that libraries at public and private colleges and universities in Indiana are at different stages of moving away from print to an online-only journal format, considering the subscription cost. Number two, staff redundancy and furloughs to lower employment. Number three, voluntary pay cuts. For example, university senior executives and councils volunteered cuts to their pay to release the pressure on the university's finances. And many universities also advocate to defer staff salary increases and all to reduce staff salaries to help keep as many jobs as possible for staff. Number four, reductions in discretionary spending, such as reducing conference travel and recruitments, as well as projects pause. Number five, closing on low enrollment courses and subjects, but maintaining high priority programs, reducing the size of school or department. Number six, campus restructuring, which can be understood as to reprioritize and restructure programs areas based upon analysis of multiple performance factors, including income and expenditures in the different areas. Lastly, promoting efficiencies by doing more with less. In addition, institutions also seek opportunities to find ways of boosting revenue. The specific approaches adopted by universities are as follows: strategic repositioning, opening overseas campuses, borrowing funds, fostering industry cooperation, adopting commercial and entrepreneurial practices, seeking philanthropic contributions, and employing professional fundraisers in order to develop alternate funding streams. Finally, it is worth mentioning that when responding, institutions need to be aware of the impact this on students. After talking about institutional responses to funding loss, now let's look at system-level responses to funding loss. Comparing with well-documented responses from institutions, the system-level responses are not that well addressed in literature. Overall, system-level responses involve increasing institutional autonomy and accountability, promoting internationalization to increase access to international markets, promoting cost sharing and student loans in place of grants and scholarships. However, so far, the response has not been to offer more money. Okay, so that's all for the literature review part on institutional and system level responses to funding loss. Now I'll hand over to my colleague Joanna to talk about policies on international students recruitment in the UK.
Thank you, Jill. So in addition to reviewing the specialized literature, we also reviewed policies on international student recruitment over a time span of 40 years, which was kind of difficult to summarize. So we broke it down into 8 landmarks that you see on the slide, starting with 1981, with the introduction of full cost tuition fees for international students under Thatcherism. So another important landmark that we'd like to point out is the expansion of the higher education sector under the Further in Higher Education Act, which essentially allowed polytechnics to become universities. So the so-called post-1992 universities in the UK. So as the number of key players increased, competition also increased. Public investment decreased, and so that's why we see the introduction of control of home student numbers, state support home student numbers in 1994. But I would say that the first explicit policy targeting international students was implemented in 1999. So under Tony Blair's Prime Minister Initiative for International Students, which set the target of 50,000 international students over 6 years. Another Prime Minister initiative was implemented in 2006, but this initiative was more sector-wide. So basically the initiative aimed to diversify the markets of international student recruitment in order to make the UK less dependent on specific countries like China and India. Well, the same countries as my colleague Georgiana pointed out, the UK is over-dependent on today. In addition to that, this strategy aimed to establish strategic partnerships and improve the international student experience. That's why we see publications around this time on the international student experience. Another thing I would like to point out is that although this time was a time of increase of international student numbers, the numbers declined in 2011 with the temporary closure of the post-study work route. So there was a decline, which meant that in 2019, the UK fell behind USA and Australia. The numbers only increased again when the post-study work visa route was introduced, implemented in 2021. That's why we see an increase in 2021. And actually, in the latest international education strategy, a goal of more than 500,000 students was set, and this goal was actually achieved in 21, so 10 years earlier, which is also the result of a particular set of circumstances. We can't forget that the UK was one of the countries that remained open to international students. Having said that, I would like to finish off with some concluding remarks, and then I will hand over to my colleague Georgiana, who will share some questions. So from our statistical analysis, literature review, policy analysis, we would like to emphasize 4 points. So as my colleague Georgiana has also said, we would like to point out that there's an over-reliance on one source of funding, meaning tuition fees from international students, and particular international students, as well as particular studies cycles, namely postgraduate thought. So there's a loss of higher education funding, which is also linked to macro, social, economic, and political factors. This requires system-level responses and institutional-level responses, which affect the functions of institutions, giving them more or less autonomy, as well as the delivery of education, meaning the closure of low enrollment courses and a shift from UG to PGT recruitment. We have also noticed a mismatch between policy and higher education realities, and this may have a detrimental effect on international student recruitment. As we saw with the temporary closure of the post-study work route, there was a decline on international student numbers. Having said that, I hand over to Georgiana for some final questions. Thank you. Georgiana, you are muted. Georgiana, you are muted.
Yeah, I had to exit the presentation mode to be able to unmute myself. So I'll go back into it right now, just very quickly. This shouldn't take more than 2 minutes. So if Jan, you want to tell us, we have very little time left.
You have actually 4 minutes, so you should be completely fine.
Okay, so this is what we've done so far for the project, and I do want to talk a bit about the project more broadly and raise 2 points I think would be useful for us to have in our conversation in addition to us answering any questions you might have. So the project overall is looking at how the UK at the institutional level is preparing for potential funding loss from international students. There are many reasons for why this may happen. We're not hoping for this to happen. We're not saying this will happen, but there's such a high reliance on international tuition fee, specifically from a few countries, that even small policy changes that have nothing to do with the UK higher education system can have a massive impact on recruitment patterns in the UK. How living permits are allocated in China internally can have a big impact in the flow of students from China in the UK. Tensions between India and the UK at the global level, on anything can have impact in terms of the flow from students from India to the UK. But also how, along the lines of what Joanna talked about, policy changes within the UK context can have a massive effect on this. And even at the moment in the UK, as we reflect on discussions around migration targets, this is a ripe discourse that would potentially lead to policies that may have a detrimental impact on international student recruitment. In the Australian case, the system has gone through a period in which there has been a loss of funding from overseas fees, and that has had a massive effect on institutions there. So what we're trying to understand is how UK is preparing for and how Australia has responded to a similar crisis. So you see our research question over there. What we want to do next in our project is have 2 case studies institutions in each country and essentially talk to various individuals within those institutions, talk about preparation in the UK and responses in Australia. And what we would like to talk to you about today is your intuition or knowledge of what case study institutions you think would be appropriate and useful to look at in the UK context. And who do you think are the individuals within the institution we should approach? And by individuals, I don't mean names of people, but roles, functions that you think would be important to offer us a picture of institutional level preparation for funding loss or funding loss from international students in the UK. And that being said, I want to thank you all for your attention, and I want to leave space for our Q&A. All references are available here, and we can chat about those afterwards. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
Perfect. We are exactly to time, basically. If anyone has a question, as we've said before, either raise your hand or write it in the chat. Though I will say, now that we are at the end, I think the organizers, the presenters would have a harder time with questions in the chat, probably because there's less time to answer. So probably good to ask verbally. But yes, either raise your hand or input the question. I can just read it out as well, if you do not feel comfortable speaking. I see a hand raised.
Yeah, Arokia back here. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I was wondering regarding the financial loss in the context of the recent pandemic, and like how did UK perform vis-a-vis the comparator countries that we were considering in the project? Would you talk me through that?
So I can give a quick reply, and Joanna or Jill, if you want to add, feel free. So the loss of international student fee funding for Australia happened during the pandemic. It was a combination of pandemic rules and essentially geopolitical tensions between China and Australia that led to those events there. And during that period, Australia did suffer quite a bit in terms of not being able to recruit international students. I want to say, though, that this is actually not a common phenomenon across the world. Very few higher education systems are reliant on fees from international students. This is not a feature of higher education systems. This is a feature of very few higher education systems. And I think UK and Australia are really the only two systems that come to mind. US as a system has a lot of international students, but it's a much smaller fraction of the total student population. So it's not a common phenomenon around the world.
Thank you, that helps.
Yeah, just to add that related to that, for example, if we think about the increase in international student numbers, the recent increase in the UK, this is also related, as Georgiana was saying, to governmental responses to COVID-19. We can't forget that the UK remained open to international students, and this led to a rebound in international student numbers. So geopolitical factors are important in policies, because we saw the negative effect of the temporary closure of the post-study work visa. And only when it was implemented again did the number of international students increase, which overlapped with the fact that the UK remained open to international students in the pandemic.
There's a request for the reference list. If you could just write your email in the chat, I can send them to you via email. The reference list is too long for me to be able to copy paste it onto the Zoom chat here. Just send me your email address and I'll forward that to you. Another thing to note is something that Jill talked about, and that is the fact that we do know from the literature we've done that funding decreases for institutions do have a big effect on students. We have found studies that look at the fact that retention for students, progression for students, graduation for students decreases when there's loss of funding. There are also consequences for the engagement and satisfaction of students. So those are inverse correlations there. That's why we wanted to note that for institutions considering any of the strategies for funding cost cutting in this picture, because there can be perverse effects associated with those funding cuts.
So final 5 minutes. So any questions? Maybe also, Georgiana, it might be good to maybe put, like some of the other people have done, put your email in the and your other speakers as well, of course, if you're comfortable with your email, and then other people can get in contact with their questions. Here we go. I'm not gonna end things early, so if 5 more minutes, if anyone wants to have any type of discussion with our final speakers, feel free. But we will end on 11:30. There we go, Richard.
Okay. I had a question about, you were saying that, this was about mainly for the UK and Australia. And what if the decline of the fees, the application will go down even more? What are the strategies for the different countries for what to do about it? Is the strategy to actually take away more education, or is it to provide national funding of any kind, or what is the policies? Could you say a few things about that?
Yeah, so Jill can talk more about this because she worked more on the lit review. But essentially, what we found is that there's no example of a country or of a government documented in the literature that has decided to all of a sudden increase funding for higher education. I think those are exceptional cases, and that's not the dominant response we're seeing. Essentially, what we're seeing is changes through regulations, but not in terms of providing more funding. I hear that in the UK context, and some of my UK colleagues can talk more about this, with the potential change in government. I think there are some efforts to potentially change something about the funding system in the UK in general. The other observation here is that the system itself is reliant too much on funding. So that's another thing that I think needs to happen in the UK. Australia, US have been much better at diversifying their funding streams altogether. So I think there's some lessons there too. But I don't think many governments are willing to give too much money to higher education. There are too many competing demands on their pockets.
Richard, I think we have time for your question, and then we'll stop.
Yeah, thank you, Georgiana and colleagues. Yeah, it's more of an observation, really. I don't know, I'm sure you thought about this, but I think there's a number of things. One, I mean, certainly in the UK context, when there's concerns about things like net migration figures and so on, student visas are being cited as one of the ways to try and reduce it. But the impact on the university sector would be massive. And interestingly, it seems particularly the universities that people assume are generally better off, the kind of the elite, the Russell Group universities will, are okay. But in fact, many of them are far more reliant upon overseas students, particularly those from maybe China and other parts of Asia. And in some subject areas, business, law, IT, engineering, things like that. And the impact on university finance will be massive. One of the issues I have, my research is largely around widening participation and giving opportunities to what would be considered students from non-traditional backgrounds in the UK. And, in a sense, if an overseas student is going to come along and pay 25 grand annual fee, that's 3 times what a home student's going to pay. And if anything, places may well be going, without sounding like, we need only UK students. We don't. We need a diversity of students. And I genuinely think having a range of students on programs offers a better experience for everyone. But it's tempting for university managers to say, oh, let's just bring in more overseas students if we can. And we can, if necessary, cut back on home students. And it's generally going to be those from less traditional backgrounds who are going to lose out, which is my concern about how these things run. And also, we just end up in any country, as you said before, Georgiana, you used the example of Australia and the geopolitical relationship with China and how that impacted, as well as things like COVID come into it and stuff. But all we need is some conflict kicking off somewhere from a country upon whom the relevant universities are reliant, and the UK and China is one of them. With various UK universities with sites overseas in China and so on. Nottingham and Liverpool and so on have got campuses in China. If there's some incident, if China invades Taiwan or something, and then they try and sever connections, then it's really going to cause huge problems in the sector. But it's just an observation rather than something necessarily seeking a response, because I think we're probably out of time anyway.
Yeah, that's exactly the concern that we're trying to also address here. I do want to say, though, that I don't know about the UK case. I haven't seen research on this in the UK, but I do know that this is a common discourse that international students displace domestic students. Evidence from the US shows us that's not the case. What happens with international students is that universities create additional openings for them. It's not that they cut access to domestic markets, and there are enough pressures, and rightfully so, on UK institutions to widen participation, and they have a strong incentive to do so, in part because that's the only way they can maintain their fee caps at the moment, if they show widening participation initiatives.
All right, I think that's maybe the note we'll end on. Thank you, everyone. Just before everyone leaves, if you want to grab the emails, a lot of them are in the chat, so a good chance to grab them now if you want to send questions or anything like that. People can continue the discussion over there. All right, thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your morning.